Go.
And now with Galatians chapter 2. I want to mention a couple of things before I get started. I want to point out that of all of the apostles, it appears that Paul was the most highly educated. He was not a fisherman, he wasn't a tax collector, he wasn't a farmer, he wasn't a carpenter. He didn't earn his living or achieve anything by work with his hands, although he was a tent maker and he did from time to time have to use that when he would enter a new area to make a living before he would start teaching. But among all of the apostles, among all the followers of this, what was a new faith at that time, he was the most knowledgeable. It needs to be noted that in order to be trained as a rabbi back then, you had to virtually memorize the Tanakh. You had to know it frontwards and backwards and be able to discuss any part of it. And so Paul was certainly able to do that, and because he could speak with such authority, he had a lot of credibility when he would enter a Jewish synagogue and begin teaching, because he was as competent as anybody, and quite frankly the most competent voice in the room when it came to preaching the Tanakh back then. And the fact that he had accepted Yeshua and accepted the prophecies of the Old Testament was very powerful. And I think that speaks a lot about why God chose him at this particular point in history. So that said, in chapter 2, Paul is then talking about some history. He says, "Then after 14 years I again went up to Jerusalem, this time with Barnabas, and I took with me Titus. I went up in obedience to a revelation. I explained to them the good news as I proclaim it among the Gentiles, but privately to the acknowledged leaders. I did this out of concern that my current or previous work might have been in vain." And we've already talked about verses 1 and 2 in Galatians chapter 2 already. This points out that Paul had already been out there delivering this message. He had been delivering this message to the Galatians. He'd been delivering it now for quite some period of time before he was told that there was going to be a famine. And then he collected money from the churches he had established, went back with Titus and Barnabas back to Jerusalem, and met privately with Yaakov, who the New Testament refers to as James, the brother of Yeshua, or half-brother of Yeshua, and with Peter. They were the acknowledged leaders of the church that time, and he told them what he had been called to do. Now, he was already known to be doing this in Jerusalem, but he really hadn't up until this time had official sanction from the church for that. Going with verse 3, "But they didn't force my Gentile companion Titus to undergo Brit Milah, or circumcision." And this is important because he's pointing out that the acknowledged leaders of the church did not force his Gentile companion Titus to become circumcised. That Titus was able to accompany him and work with him and help him preach and do this work without having to undergo circumcision. Indeed, the question came up only because some men who pretended to be brothers had been sneaked in. They came in surreptitiously to spy out the freedom we have in the Messiah Yeshua so that they might enslave us. And what he's talking about is a faction in the Jewish faith back then, the Pharisees, that snuck some people in to see what it was they were talking about. "Not even for a minute did we give in to them, so that the truth of the good news might be preserved for you. Moreover, those who were acknowledged leaders, what they were makes no difference to me. God does not judge by outward appearances. These leaders added nothing to me. On the contrary, they saw that I had been entrusted with the good news for the uncircumcised, just as Kefa, or Peter, had been for the circumcised. Since the one working in Kefa to make him an emissary to the circumcised had worked in me to make me an emissary to the Gentiles." So it appeared that there's a division of labor here. That Kefa, or Peter, is working to spread this good news to those Jews who are already practicing the Jewish faith, and that Paul's task was to spread this beyond Jerusalem and reach out to Gentiles and God-fearers and other people that had not been raised in the Jewish faith. "So having perceived what grace had been given to me, Yaakov, Peter, and John, the acknowledged pillars of the community, extended to me and Barnabas the right hand of fellowship." And this is very important. that they were making him a partner, so to speak, in what was being preached out there. That they were equal partners. They gave him the right hand of fellowship, so that we might go to the Gentiles and they to the circumcised. Their only request was that we should remember the poor, which very thing I have spared no pains to do. So he's setting the background. He's letting the Galatians know that he has the approval of the pillars of the church to preach the gospel that he has been preaching. And this answers a criticism that the circumcision faction had made, that he did not have this authority. Verse 11. Furthermore, when Kefa came to Antioch, I opposed him publicly, because he was clearly in the wrong. For prior to the arrival of certain people, the community headed by Yaakov, he had been eating with the Gentile believers. But when they came, he withdrew and separated himself because he was afraid of the faction who favored circumcising Gentile believers. What he's noting here is that when Kefa came to Antioch to visit Paul and visit the church there, when he started off, he was eating with the Gentiles, he was associating with the Gentiles, and it's important to remember that under Jewish law at that time, that was a no-no. You did not go to a Gentile's house, you did not have fellowship with them, you did not socialize with them, you certainly did not eat with them, you just didn't do that. But when a group who claimed to be coming under authority of James or Yaakov showed up, then suddenly Kefa and Barnabas altered their behavior. They no longer associated with the Gentiles. They didn't eat with them, and Paul took them to task on this. And as other Jewish believers became hypocrites along with him, so that even Barnabas was led astray by their hypocrisy. But when I saw that they were not walking a straight path, keeping in line with the truth of the good news, and what he's talking about here is Peter had already preached, and it's in Acts, where Peter talked about the vision he had with the 3 sheets coming down and the animals there. Some of those had been rendered unclean. It was around this time that Peter actually talked to Cornelius and brought Cornelius into the faith, who was a Gentile. And that's based on Peter's vision that there is no difference. There is no difference in following Yeshua between Gentile and Jew. There is no difference. And so that is the straight path to the Messiah. And worshiping Yeshua is a straight path. It does not require a detour into Judaism. I said to Kefa right in front of everyone, if you who are a Jew live like a Goy or live like a Gentile and not like a Jew, why are you forcing the Goyim to live like Jews? Now, if you read the King James version of this, it says, but when I saw that they walked not uprightly, according to the truth of the gospel, I said unto Peter before them all, if thou, being a Jew, livest after the manner of Gentiles, and not as do the Jews, why compellest thou the Gentiles to live as do the Jews? Now this section has been very confusing for a lot of people. They don't quite understand what Paul is trying to say here, and that's a big criticism of Paul generally, that he speaks very academically and speaks sometimes above the capability of those around him to understand. But what Paul is trying to say here is, if you, Peter, who are Jewish, you've been living as a Gentile, you've been associating with them, you've been eating with them, you've been doing all these non-Jew things. And if you're going to do that and not